Hello, welcome to Psychopath in Your Life. This is episode number 136, and I'm your host, Dianne Emerson. Today I'm going to be covering kind of a grouping of things. And first, I'd like to make an announcement. If you want to send me an email message, the private email box is down below, and also check any show links there. And you have to fill in your email address if you want me to respond to your email, because otherwise I don't have access to that. So, anyway, with that said, let's cover a few things today. There's been a lot of, well, I got to cover three different things today. One is Hitler, where'd she come up with that one? Because I want to cover the Epstein, why I think that the body was likely more snatched than suicided. Also, how do we know who is what in this day and age? I mean, we have mainstream media. We all pretty much understand what their role is in bad information. And then the last few years, we've had this thing about fake news. But fake news really isn't a new thing. It's just what's being spread out now. So I like to cover all of those things because the whole purpose of this channel is to give victims a voice. And there's just a lot of stuff going on in the air right now as far as what's going on in the world. And a lot of it doesn't necessarily happen to be true, but it's just still going out there and people are perceiving it as being true. So that's all it really takes a lot of times. The old, if you tell that lie often enough, pretty soon it'll sound like the truth. Um, yeah, people have been since the beginning of time spying on other people. They've been, I don't know, back in the old days, we used to have competitive file cabinet set up so that we would gather up information on our competition. Then, as the internet came along, companies actually have teams of people who monitor things on social media. So, this has been going on for a very long time. And what has led up to all this has been the advent of technology. And it's very typical of most psychopathic type relationships. How it works is that they have to convince you that they're there to help you and that it's a good thing. So now that that's all been convinced, we're down to just a few companies that are really in charge of things. So we really don't have, there's a lot of talk, people saying, oh, the left this, the right that. We really don't have a two-party system. That's where the first big issue comes into this, is that there really only is a one-party system here. And I'll go through a few examples of why I think that. And it's really set up to the longer that the people on the ground, meaning us, are arguing about this is something somebody on the left did or somebody on the right did, it keeps us very distracted because that's the whole goal. Because the more we're arguing amongst each other, the more things that are going to just slip by the rest of us. So that's how we ended up in the spot that we're in now, where we have all these psychopaths just very firmly in charge. So it didn't just happen last week. It's been happening for a really long time. So the catch is going to be is what are we going to do about it? There seems to be a certain amount of naivety out there that these people are just going to give up control, and that's really not how these things play out. So um, what I'd like to talk about is that in doing research, I'm always looking for allies, not teams, because here's the problem with teams. Once you get into a team, you have to put your blinders on. So the team, for example, all agrees that, let's say a team all agrees that child abuse is bad, okay? But then the team also has other beliefs that they have. They believe, let's say, that the guy in charge is going to do something about it. So they're living in this belief system, okay? Um, but in that belief system, when you go into a team, you lock out a lot of the gray area in life. So you're no longer functioning, you're functioning too much a little bit in the black and white and not enough in the gray. So while it feels good to be on a team because teams are always trying to win against the other team, what it's really doing is it's just further breakdowning society. Because we only have one ruling team, and that's the elites. Because how can we think otherwise? Look around. Excuse me. In this country, we don't even have a voting system that is functioning. So we got this idea a few years ago with this fake news, and the idea came because of, during the elections and whatnot. There's, ads being run on Facebook and whatnot, and they say that like 80% of the people find their news on Facebook, which should be concerning enough. Just that right there. Um, but here's the thing: is that if you're on a team, then all you're going to do is try to beat the other team. So you're not going to see any vulnerable parts about your team. For example, we've had the big uproar this week was over Ellen from the Ellen Show, and she had George W. Bush. They were in some rich guy's box watching a football game or something and laughing together. So there was all this outrage over, oh, Ellen's laughing it up with that war criminal Bush. Well, we hear that all the time. For example, people will say about the guy in charge now, the Lorne for the old days when Obama was in charge. Well, Obama was a mass murderer just like W was. So before we start to yearn for the old days, we should really understand how we're being played between all these groups of people. For example, we had George W. Bush go into Iraq over 9/11, which, well, we could argue that all day long, the logic in doing that. But anyway, a lot of people lost their lives. I mean, a lot, close to about hundreds of thousands, maybe a million people, excuse me, lost their lives in the deal. Well, what happened was that kicked open the Patriot Act. Okay, so that gave him power to go, and the government power to become our spy master. So it unleashed all of these tools that they're now using now to spy on us and to also keep things going for the next administration. So, for example, George W. Bush, when Obama came into power, there was a decision made by Obama not to prosecute George W.'s administration for any war crimes. Why? Well, he said, let's move on. Well, he went along and did a bunch of war crimes, escalated the wars himself. And so, of course, he didn't suffer any war crimes because remember, the president was, let's move on. So if you think the guy in charge now is any different, I've got news for you because it's all a continuum of the same. And I'm not here to try to change your political ideas. I mean, you can do, if you want to stay on a team, that's great for you. But remember, as long as you're on the team, you're not going to see a lot of the gray areas going along around there. So, for example, why the outrage over Ellen sitting next to George W.? I don't know. He was on her show over a year ago dancing. I was pretty outraged back then. So, what's happening is that there's this effort to make it sound like the people on the left team are into allowing children to be abused and the people on the right aren't. And that's really totally not true at all. I'm pretty far on the left, but I don't go on teams, I go on the truth. So how do I know that it's just a thing with the left? Well, it's not, because this has been going on forever. It's a problem with society where we've gotten into this deal with children. It has nothing to do with a team or another team, because that logic falls away. If you think it's just people on the left, then how do you explain all the Catholic Church abuse? Are all those people liberals, or are they on the right, or what side is it? See, there's where you get into problems with this team business. So, and remember when crime started happening on the internet, we had the Ramsey case, and that case was full of people there to spin the deal. So in all these cases, I always find people that are there to spin the deal. So like in the Epstein case, it's become like the latest thing since the Chris Watts case, very much of a clickbait kind of a thing. So when I do research, I'm always looking for who is here with the truth and who's here spinning this deal. So first, when you start to research, you need to wipe out and get the people to the side that are there to spin things. And in every case, there's always people there to spin things. This case is no different at all, except for to a lot of people, these cases becomes a means of income. So yeah, you have to look at the whole picture and think, when you're gathering information, just because somebody logs on and says, hey, I've discovered the answer to the universe and here's what it is, and ask yourself, where did this person get this information from? How do they sit there and tell you that yes, Epstein was definitely suicided? Based on what? We don't know what. I'm going to lay out today why I think it was more likely a body switch. But why do people, there's no test and no application to buy a microphone. So I mean, I've been looking and talking about psychopaths for over 20, 25 years now, and we are in fact surrounded by them. And I don't know why, but I'm feeling probably more alarmed than a lot of people are. Um, I feel very alarmed about the children in the world. I don't know how people are even thinking about having children with the way that things are right now. It's a it's a global problem, and it just gets worse by classes. It has nothing to do with the elites don't have the market locked up on raping children, okay? It's a worldwide problem. So here again, gets back to my theme as far as the teams. Once we start identifying just one group of people as being the problem, then we're overlooking whole other groups of people who are perpetuating the problem, looking the other way over the problem, or participating in the problem. So we have to get away from this team business as far as whose team are you on. Because, for example, like in the Ramsey case, they had three people who were posting under the same name. I think we used to call them hats back then. I don't know why, but there were three people posting under the same name. So that was took a little bit of work to sort out that it was them, but we got it sorted out. But yeah, so since the beginning of time, there's always people around. Like, for example, we have this thing going on now with, Bill Maloney's kind of disappeared off the scene, and now we've got Wedger coming back on the scene. So we've got a lot of people who tend to be in these things to spin things that kind of come and go. So always consider your sources when you're looking at these things, okay? Because you're running from you think you're running from mainstream media to YouTube. Good plan, right? Who wants to pay those cable bills? Um, but remember, in the 1990s was when the Clintons hatcheted down all the telecommunications. So about the 1990s was when all of the everything got merged into just four or five, six people run everything now. So we've been heading in this direction for a really long time. So we didn't just get there because of a particular party of people that were in charge. We've gotten there because the entire system has propped up this deal. So people run to YouTube now to get away from mainstream media. But over half the channels on YouTube are mainstream media channels. And the other part of the channels are people like myself or people who, want to spread the news or whatever. And so you need to always be in a position to be validating your sources. Like, is this person, do they have a breadth of knowledge to be making these kinds of statements? How true is any of this stuff? Because if the whole effort is to get you onto a team, welcome to the internet. So, anyway, so because teams are easy to get onto, like, for example, if I wanted to start an elite team, there's ways. I mean, you can go and get TED Talks to become an elevated team member. Um, you can go over to YouTube and find people who you can team up with there. But I would really recommend that try to take your team cap off at times and look around a little bit more and seeing if you're not just buying into things that you've been trained to accept. I know I was raised to train to accept a lot of things, which I'm now finding out aren't true. So um, let's talk a little bit about why would I think that it's possible that the body was switched with Epstein. Well, the reason I think it's possible, or more probable than not, is because, well, for a lot of reasons. One is that it would send a really bad message to other procurers of children that, you step out of line and they're going to, take care of you or take you out of the picture, take you out. They're probably going to take care of you. In other words, send you off to some remote island somewhere where you have, a staff of people to manage you and whatnot. So, because he's very typical, close to a Savile type person, except for in this case, he had a jet versus a motorhome. So, he was able to access children around the world with his jet, whereas Savile was confined to that motorhome. So, they basically both played the same role. So, if they were going to murder anybody, they would have certainly taken a whack at Savile, but they didn't. And they can't because it exposes too many people up the food chain. So it'll be interesting to see if anything happens to this. I doubt that anything ever will. So it makes much more sense that they would have switched the body, and here's why. First of all, the two guards were asleep for 3 hours, which kind of indicates the possibility of maybe something was put into their drink, so they slept for 3 hours. The cameras happened to be not working. There happened to be a photographer there to take a couple of good shots, which I laid out in another show how that one shot going to the hospital was an odd shot to be able to make under normal circumstances. Okay, camera's not working. I would be convinced that it was him if there was some sort of DNA, but there's not going to be any DNA. They're playing the long game. That's why they brought in Barr. You'll have to look at the other episodes on that. All of these people interconnect. So here that kind of takes apart a little bit of the right versus the left out of this argument here, because the people that were brought in to the White House when this thing started raising its ugly head again all come from a past of being on the right. And they all come from a CIA past and different kinds of groups like that. So when you start thinking about teams, start to analyze who's on these teams. And it's just really usually a different set of characters, because do you really think that everybody acted like they were so worried about Trump getting into office? Okay. If they were really so worried, why did they leave these War Act things open? Why did they increase his military budget by billions of dollars? Why does he have all this authority? That's not really how you behave with somebody you're that worried about, okay? So it's going to be a little bit of a struggle because people are used to being on these teams. So when you start to peek your head out of your team hole there, take a look around and think, what makes my team so much better than that team? Is it because your team's in charge now and so you think your team's going to clean up the thing? Good luck on that one, because we have had one evolution of psychopaths in charge for many years now. So I'm not really sure how any of them are going to be better than the last one. So anyway, so let's get back to Hitler here. Now this was a much more complicated body switch, because Epstein would have been much easier to switch out. So it was on the 1st of May, 1945. So that was when they announced the death on the German radio. But it was kind of interesting because the Allies, Germany was coming down at that point, okay? The Allies were fully entrenched there. So why did the German government announce that Hitler was dead? Well, that's a big question there, right? So because every documentary I saw, they always showed the scene where Hitler, I think they have it set up so Eva Braun took the poison and Hitler took the shot in the head. But what was interesting is that when the bunker was finally seized, it was by the Soviets, and it was covered by a BBC guy. These BBC people are all the way through these cases, aren't they? But it was concluded by witnesses and the doctor who were at the discovery of Hitler's corpse that it was a bad body double. It didn't even really look that great of a body double, because back then a lot of people used body doubles. Maybe they still do now. I don't know. But body doubles had been used throughout World War II. Stalin had many. Churchill had at least one. And it's certain that Hitler had used them. The fact remained that no one could prove that they had found Hitler's body. The official report, which was released in November of 1945 by British intelligence, concluded, this is interesting how this official report got concluded by British intelligence, but then the Soviets had the body, okay. The intelligence concluded that Hitler had died in the bunker and his body had burned outside the bunker. With no proof of the body, suspicions rose at the highest levels. Both Stalin and, I think it was, let me see here, Eisenhower, refused to believe that he was dead, that Hitler was dead. And they carried this belief through their whole lives. It wasn't just like some random thing, okay? Because in the following years, the FBI actually carried out many investigations into reported sightings of Hitler. Then in 1968, the Soviets changed their story. They said that they had dug up Hitler's charred remains in 1945 and had kept them all along. So all along, up until 1968, everybody figured that the body was burned and was still laying there. So what they did was they claimed they had matched a jawbone to Hitler's dental records, and that a piece of his skull with a bullet hole in it confirmed his suicide. This seemed to convince people of his death until 40 years later. And in 2009, DNA testing confirmed that the remains belonged to that of a 40-year-old woman. To this day, they have not allowed any further testing. So going back to the official British intelligence report, this was the official report, okay? This is why everything we've probably been told has been one big lie. So it turned out that it had been made not by a forensic expert. This is where it gets interesting. In other words, the person that did this report wasn't a forensic expert. Okay, they were they weren't from Scotland Yard or the FBI. It was made by a professor of medieval history and relied solely on the statements made under interrogation by the Soviets. All the witnesses had retracted their statements at a later date and said they had never spoken to the professor. So what happened was that um, the people that were interviewed were by this professor of medieval history. That's kind of interesting because the same way that Kinsey was brought in by the Rockefellers, and he was a bug guy, a zoologist or something, to teach us about sex. So, yeah, this medieval history person is kind of interesting. So, yeah, so that's how they switched out Hitler, more likely than not, okay? And they also had some other interesting things that they had been doing about that time with underground bunkers and stuff like that. So, there's a lot more flavor to all of that. But yeah, I'm pretty much convinced that Hitler was switched out. I remember I saw a documentary years ago about there were some allegations that he was in South America somewhere. I'm sure he's probably not alive now because this would have been, well, he would have been 50 or so and 45. So yeah, he's way dead. But yeah, so I feel stronger that he probably didn't die in the bunker. Dying in the bunker doesn't make any sense at all. The other thing about dying in the bunker was that now, if this is true, okay, because you have to kind of go back and question everything. He had a tremendous drug problem throughout his life, really high on the injections, and um, I think it was Parkinson he was coming down with. So if you look at some of the last clips where he was out meeting the new recruits and stuff, his hand shakes so bad. He's holding his hand like he's holding his hand behind his back, and it's like shaking. So that kind of to me says, God, these shaking hands. I mean, you know, a bullet. That never really added up to me. How do you shoot yourself in the head when your hand is shaking so bad you have to control it with the other hand? So, yeah, so I believe they just were switched off somewhere. So, if we can sit here and figure out that Epstein was, they had those 3 hours. I mean, a lot can happen in 3 hours, okay? And then remember, they always hide these things under the guise of security. So, we'll never know about this stuff. So, I would be convinced if I saw some DNA. I would also be convinced if we weren't completely run by psychopaths who have done nothing but lie and cheat to us our whole lives. But besides that, I'm probably not going to be convinced that he didn't escape somewhere. Because that would be more likely the case of how these pedophile rings operate. And that's just based on my understanding of pedophile rings. So if anybody else has any other ideas about where he might have ended up, I'm all ears. But I kind of think that he's off somewhere. It's not that hard to change features and all that. And just for today, I'd like to remind you to check back in on Tuesdays. I'll be doing shows on Tuesdays when I can. There's I don't know, there's so much going on in the world with the children and everything that if we don't keep talking about this, who's going to? I don't hear anybody talking about the victims in any of this. All I hear about are people posturing for views and whatnot. So, kind of rambling today. There's just been a lot on my mind as far as where are we going to go with all this stuff. Still doing some research about the McCann case. You have to tell me what you'd like to do next. I'll be reading the comments, and any way you can help the show is appreciated. And we need to get out there because talking about children that are being raped by the elites is only one small portion of this entire picture here. So this isn't a right or a left issue. This is a worldwide issue. So if you ever think about having kids or if you have children in your life, I mean, let's try to wake up, folks, not down, because it's not a good picture out there. And it's actually worse than I'm letting on. And we're never going to get to the bottom of it if we don't start talking and bringing this into our own homes and communicating with children about all this. So, anyways, hopefully I'll see you next Tuesday. Be safe out there and talk to you later. Goodbye for now.